I think running a successful company is the hardest thing in the world to do. It's much easier to turn around a struggling company, especially if you're coming in fresh, than it is to run a successful company, because you're fighting all of these biases that we naturally have, not just as individuals, but how we work as a team.
We're going to get into your book, Big Bet Leadership, which I loved reading, getting ready for this interview. But how do you minimize the risk of things like this happening? Like AWS has, 30% of the cloud market around the world. So how do you minimize risk on this? You've been involved in some pretty big projects. What's your thought?
So the thing I think about on something like this, a couple of things. A is that you have to have both a world-class operating playbook and a transformation playbook. And I tend to focus more today in kind of that transformation reinvention playbook, but you have to have this truth-seeking, high standards, operational excellence playbook, and just not allow yourself to kind of get complacent, to get lazy relative to that. The other thing I think about is this concept of anti-fragile design. And what an anti-fragile system is it's not just resilient to change, it actually gets better with change, right? And so as you and I were talking about, when they get to the real fifth why of why this happened, I think it's going to come down to some type of single-threaded dependency that they had within one region and they didn't realize it. And it will set forth a set of re-architecting and scrutinizing, like how could one release, one probably bad configuration cause a system-wide issue like this? And how do we design a system that can't fail in that manner? So we not only prevent like this type of, I'm assuming as some sort of release error that happened or something like that, but an actual architecture that doesn't have a single-threaded kind of dependency or weak link to it. So those are the two things that I think about relative to this, and then having a culture that allows for truth-seeking conversations without kind of the blame game that can get closely tied to that kind of insight. And you have to be clear about the job to be done, right? On the first job to be done is fix the issue. The second job to be done is then like, how do we design in this anti-fragile manner? The third issue is then, or job to be done is then like, all right, like where did personal accountability perhaps play a role in this, and what should we do in that? But those are three different jobs. Don't do them all at the same time.
Yeah. Well, every couple of years, as we were talking about, when AWS goes down, it affects at least three of my businesses in a significant way. It's never that long. It's usually just a couple of days at most. But it kind of gets to almost like complacency. So I think there's business model complacency. Will this thing keep working? And then will our product or service, continually deliver and continually improve the experience for our customers out there? And
and then probably another one, which is like kind of the key dependency complacency, right? Like I have a trusted vendor or a key customer that I just assume is always going to be there for me, to deliver for me, consume from me, and that's a dangerous assumption to make, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great category that all fits in there. When I think about the change or the pace of change is happening right now, I've heard you talk in podcasts plus your book around, if you thought change was fast around the .com bubble and what was happening back around 2000, today it's even faster. What do you think the biggest forces are going to be that are going to impact that for small, medium, and even large businesses? And I think a lot about small and mid-sized businesses because that's the majority of business out there.
Yeah. Well, I think as we outline in Big Bet Leadership, I think about kind of three macro changes tied together with this common thread that goes across all. So the three macro factors that we outlined as part of the hyper digital era, which is this era of what I think is going to be exhilarating change, which creates either opportunity and or challenges in your business is one is kind of technology, right? And so AI is just one. I think we've really had an exciting just recent era on stable coin, and that I think that that's going to be a transformative, kind of payments technology, computer vision, the promise of fusion energy. It's not going to stop at AI, but it's kind of easy to categorize them all under AI, and everything, right? The second is um, the shortage of skilled labor and the cost of skilled labor, which I think is going to hit every business. And between the declining birth rate and the increasing aging of America, like that's a mega force that's just accelerating. Again, presents opportunities if you can figure out a business that either rides that mega force and or solves for that problem. That puts you in the driver's seat relative to the mega force. And then the third is just the indebtedness of our societies, and the fact that, whether it's an inflationary pressure or a cut in social services or the chaos that I think is not going to stop. If anything, is going to just accelerate from an international standpoint. Like, we are in an era of chaos. And if your plan is, well, I'm going to wait until it's a little less chaotic, I think that's a high risk perspective to have. I think you need to figure out how to plan for that chaos. And then the thread that ties all of those together is the abundance, not just the abundance of investable capital, but it's investors like NVIDIA, Amazon, Microsoft, and private equity firms who have built a playbook that they have high confidence in, of like, how do we actually take on a use case, an industry, a company, and create something new and substantially better. And so, they've learned that playbook over the past, call it 30 years of digital transformation. I think that those are the four factors, and there's probably more, but those are the ones that I think about that are going to create this era, which gets to the thesis of big bet leadership, which is, not only are we not good at these types of transformations or reinventions of ourselves, but I think this is going to be the skill set of winning companies going forward, is that they have both world-class operations and they're systematic about how they reinvent themselves at a company, at a team, as an individual leader. And I think that ability to hold both of those as mandates for a leader and for a leadership team and for a business, I think, is the big change that's needed. Most companies don't think that way. Innovation or reinvention is a sporadic or, part-time hobby form. They don't prioritize the development of those types of skills. They don't have the clear language or frameworks to differentiate between them. They because there's some common words between the two of them, they think, oh, just because I'm a good operator, I know how to run a program in the reinvention half of my playbook, and flat out you don't, right? And history demonstrates that fact. So those are both the forces that we're talking about, as well as the mandate of building your, we'll call it reinvention big bet playbook to complement your world-class operating playbook, which still needs to be strengthened and and built upon.
Yeah, that all makes a ton of sense. Something that I think threads through all of it is change is really hard. Everybody talks about it. Thousands of leaders have written about it. I believe that we need to change our relationship with struggle, because when it's hard, people think something's wrong, but all the opportunity in the world is in the struggle. It's like going to the gym, you get really fit. That was a very healthy struggle. I think for business leaders, it's a really healthy struggle to develop these capabilities. If we could change that mindset. So how have you looked at that? Because the projects that you've been involved with, the teams you've been part of, obviously world-class, winning in such a big way, they didn't run from struggle. They leaned into it. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I would just say amen to everything you just said, which is it is the struggle that make things rewarding. And as an organization, if you too many organizations think of this as like a transformation or a program, but it's that, but it's also just a core organizational habit and DNA, a muscle capacity, just like as you reference, I use that reference all the time. Like you got to go to the sweaty gym all the time so that you have the potential, the opportunity for potentially having a championship moment, right? And yeah, so I wrote about that in the free ebook. You mentioned my business manifesto, which is like you can't wait until you need to do this. You need to do it when you have the advantage of a healthy business and some time to do it. That's when you have to make fast, dramatic change in compressed periods of time. That's when you really run short on options, and you won't like the medicine that you're going to have to take with that.
Yeah, I like everything that you're saying there. I work with a lot of different businesses and I love it from startup to I think the biggest so far is around 80 billion market cap. And one company just changed hands. I was with them this morning in a meeting. And so there's half new guard on the senior team and half old guard. And the old guard is, can't we just relax and stay right here? Why do we have to change? The fastest to no culture I've ever seen. The new guard is like all about going forward. And I think we want to build in what you're talking about, which is this is the way we operate. We come in every day looking for that better way, which there always is, and we can think of. It's our job to find it and be comfortable being uncomfortable. A lot say that, but putting that in place culturally is tough. What's your advice for establishing that culture?
Um, A is having a book club as an executive team is a powerful way to drive a conversation like that. Obviously, I have a couple of books that I would recommend, but there's lots of good books. But that's why I think books are so important because a good book. I'll
Mm.
caveat it with that. A good book is like this condensed power pill. And if you do it as a team, then you can reflect like, well, what does that mean to us? So that's one move I would do. And the second move is like, you got to look at incentive systems, right? So, there's this concept. I wrote a book called Think Like Amazon, 50 and a half ideas, right? And one of the ideas in that book is about preventing the country club mindset, right? And a country club mindset is, well, once you're in the country club, you want to prevent everybody else from getting in the club, right? Like that's what you do in a country club is you want to get in, but then you don't want anybody else to get in. And that's what happens with successful companies and successful executives is the bias to it's called loss aversion, right? It's a real thing that you prioritize not losing what you have versus creating something new of value, even when you intellectually understand that the EV, the expected value of the future, highly outvalues the potential loss of the current state. And so the way you address that within an executive team, within a board, is through incentive systems, right? Roger Martin, very good professor up in Toronto, wrote a book called A New Way to Think. One of the new ways to think he talks about is just by tweaking the stock windowing that typically goes on within boards and executive teams, you create kind of this mindset of vitality. Your job isn't to just deliver a revenue or an enterprise value for today, but it's a vitality for tomorrow. Pharmaceutical companies do a very good job at this, right? They actually have something called Vitality Index, which is a measure of how much of revenue comes from products that have been released in the last 3 to 5 years versus legacy products. You need to figure out some way of truly incenting everyone at the board and the executive level to play a longer game than just this short-term optimization game.
Yeah, and I experienced, John, that what you're talking about happens at a growing percentage the bigger the companies get. I see less of it in the smaller ones. There's something about human nature there, right?
Well, it's because they still are leaning forward with kind of that entrepreneurial hungry mindset. They don't have much to lose versus like, I have all of this to lose. And so you start, playing defense versus offense. And Howard Schultz did a very powerful podcast interview And it was a long form interview, and they essentially asked him what happened at Starbucks. And I'm paraphrasing now, but he said, the worst thing that can happen, like a sports team, is that you start playing defense, because just like a sports team, you need to stay on the offense. And he goes, and that's related to another thing that happened at Starbucks, which is hubris, right? We suffered from a lack of humility. And there's lots of ways that you can build humility into a business. Your metrics and how you do root cause analysis is one of those key ways that you continue to build humility, as well as goal setting. And I talk about that in my business manifesto. But that's what happens with successful companies, is they stop playing offense. So they stop taking calculated risks, and they get a little egotistical. Like, yeah, we know what we're doing. This won't happen to us. So like, that could never happen to us, and everything, right? Until it does.
Those are some of the biggest barriers I run into. And obviously there's tons of stories out there of companies that went down because they just sat on their hands, got defensive and didn't really go forward.
Let's can I lean in on that for just a minute? So I think most people, when we talk about like this disruption, we tend, as you were alluding to, kind of think about these classic cases of, Blockbuster, Xerox PARC, IBM, Kodak, companies that literally invented the vital technologies of today, but they failed to take advantage of them because of these issues that we're talking about. But think about the recent gold standard brands, category definers, category leaders who are suffering their version of this today. So listen to this set of companies, and you tell me if these companies have kind of lost their moment here and everything, right? Boeing,
I came from aerospace, 100%. Yeah.
Intel,
Yeah.
Starbucks, Nike, right? Like all legendary, vital companies, category leaders who are suffering their version of kind of this lack of calculated risk taking, and likely a degree of a lack of humility, and they let their companies become compromised, right? They became complacent. That's why I wrote that Playbook of Champions free ebook, was to help package together like what I saw as the three major plays. I reference Big Bet Leadership, but obviously Big Bet Leadership is a book into itself. But you need to keep all of these things kind of in motion as a leader at a successful company. I think running a successful company is the hardest thing in the world to do. It's much easier to turn around a struggling company, especially if you're coming in fresh, than it is to run a successful company, because you're fighting all of these biases that we naturally have, not just as individuals, but how we work as a team.
Well, I think we're fighting a drive for complacency. You come in from the outside, you can see it. You've laid it all out. Hey, from awareness to ongoing customer experience, our support structure. Okay, I see red, green, and yellow everywhere. Let's shore it up. But keeping it going, I think we're just fighting this human nature need to. I just want to come in and have everything normal. This sort of complacency piece of it. Now, when you talked about a vitality index, I actually believe every company can have that. When I was building my aerospace business, we ended up with sold it to Textron in 2016, but we had probably 2,000 customers over 60 countries, a lot of employees. Our engineering department, so about 50 individuals, our vitality index was everything they were developing today was our future growth in revenue and profitability, and ultimately the value of the business. Because I think the number one job of every CEO is to responsibly and continually increase the value of their business. And I think every single business could have a vitality index. And if they're looking at that, I think it's quite genius, I think, to bring it front and center the way you're talking about.
Amen.
Now
Absolutely.
we can't ignore it. So what is our vitality index?
And you need to make it as a key incentive driver at both the board and the entire executive team, right? Not just, your CEO and the head of innovation, but head of operations, head of IT. Like, everybody needs to own that, because you need everybody to give their best and to give focused and to make it a priority. Not just, you can't say, well, transformation belongs to that team, and everything. You should have a team that is the point for that. But especially at the leadership level, everybody has to be deeply involved and be a stakeholder in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. Some sort of incentive around, profitability, stock, cash, whatever that is. But here's the kicker, an extra 10%, 20, whatever for the vitality index score.
Absolutely.
Over or under. So brilliant. One of the things you talk about in the book, playing it safe is perhaps the most risky thing you can do in business. I 100% agree. So just talk about that a little bit.
I mean, to some degree, that's just another framing for what we've been talking about, which is like, can't we just have a normal day? Can't we just kind of glide a little bit and take it easy? That is complacency manifested right there. And taking calculated risks is how you actually, like, that's what an entrepreneur does. That is what an innovator does, is they take calculated risks. That is the opposite of playing it safe. When you play it safe, you just do incremental, more of the same, which is good, but it is not sufficient. You have to have a portfolio of calculated moves that you're thinking about, and always be testing in a lightweight way. And then that both helps keep humility, that keeps your eye on the market and the future market, and you'll spot an opportunity. It's like, well, we need to do more on this specific concept of our portfolio and move it forward in, again, a risk calculated manner, leading with experimentation, right? High ambition, high risk moves are the way that you change the future of a company. Those things, that's what a big bet is. That is what a transformation is. The mistakes are bountiful, but the two essential ones are, I'm thinking of a fence line here, right? And you've got an error on one side of the fence and an error on the other side of the fence. The error on one side of the fence is that we think we have a great idea and we just go for it, and everything, right? That's an error, because those things don't work out that way. You can't predict these high risk, high dependency, high ambition strategies. The other is, hey, we just play it safe, right? We don't have any bold moves in our portfolio. Well, that leads to a very stale and at-risk business. The fine line of fence that we need to create is a set of high ambition, high risk potential moves we could do, figure out how we test those things out, and move them from high ambition, high risk to high ambition, low risk. That's the job of experimentation to do. That's what we outline in Big Bet Leadership is the actual habits and tactics to do those moves.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. So far in my 45-year overnight success story, I've kind of distilled it down to my definition of strategy is approaches to increasing the value of the business. And there will be strategic initiatives. And when I look at strategy decks from companies, when I go into work with them to help them execute, usually the bigger companies, there could be over 100 strategic initiatives. And I usually find there's no more than about 15 or 20 that will really move the needle. The rest of them I put in this category called please do your job. But I like having a list of things that'll move the needle, and I want a culture of continuous improvement innovation going on. I want both happening.
Yeah, you want both. Yeah.
And then what you're talking about here, so I built some things assuming they would come. I think I know for sure my single biggest miss, it cost me, I wrote off $27 million personally. Okay, that didn't work, but turned the page and went on. Packaging and testing inexpensively, very quickly to de-risk anything that we're doing as a business that's going to be kind of a big bet. Walk through what you've learned there. I've made one really big mistake, a few smaller mistakes, but wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Richard Rumont wrote a very good book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And what good strategy, bad strategy frames or postulates is that good strategy actually identifies a core problem or challenge in the business, and then a philosophy and set of tactics to address that problem. That is what good strategy is. Bad strategy is just the opposite, which is kind of vague goals and vague hope and aspirations and everything, right? So we took that fundamental framework of what good strategy is, and we help manifest it and add in a layer of experimentation relative to that. So what we believe a business has to do is to, at the right level, identify the core problem that your customer has or your operator has or your cost model has, postulate a hypothesis, like a tangible hypothesis of what that future state is so that you can taste it, you can feel it, like you can really understand it. And then identify, well, what are the truly critical things that have to be true, but that are high risk relative to that future state. And if you take that level of design and identifying those, then you can actually prioritize and define a set of short, very specific experiments or tests or information seeking exercises to actually understand that factor better. But what happens in most companies is we have a vague understanding of the problem that we're solving. We have a vague, an even vaguer understanding of what the future state is. We don't try to identify what the real risks are. We think of the risk as really an execution risk primarily, right? And that is a risk, but that is extremely manageable. What is unmanageable is, will the market respond in the way that I want? Will engineering be able to solve this cost model problem? Will we be able to solve for the churn rate that is an inherent part of this business? If you get to that level of specification, you can bring those forward and you can typically figure out a way to experiment or test or learn much more about that factor to inform your strategy before you go forward with it.
Yeah, I love that. The thinking product, service, and here's a change, how we're solving a problem, want to go out in the world. I also believe we can do this by function. Like there can be really big moves in a function to do something differently. We could have something amazing and the world doesn't know about it, doesn't matter. So when you drive these things, bigger bets, you've got the overall company and complete alignment around it. But then you have these functional. Do you have any examples of functional bets?
Well, yeah, yes, but I agree. Like we wrote this for the enterprise, but you can apply it for a function, for a team. Really, I've had people say, I've used this for my own self and everything, right? And this notion, but I think a technology team or supply chain is a classic example of a function that takes on a transformation, and they either get right about and seek truth about the problems they are trying to solve and what they're trying to optimize in the future and what the future truly looks like. What are you willing to compromise on? And what are the high risk things that have to be true to achieve that future? You can absolutely do that at the team or function level. And yeah, supply chain and the IT function are the two classic ones that I've been involved in.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
And specifically on supply chain, in this era of kind of chaos and dependencies, thinking through kind of back to this AWS story of like these single threaded supply functions and how do we design in flexibility, anti-fragile capabilities, redundancy, like all these good things that survive a bad negotiation, survive a bad outage, survive a tariff, survive, whatever it is. That's the proactive way of figuring out, how do I take advantage of this chaos that not only are we in, it is always going to be here. If anything, it's going to be more. That's what a really good forward-looking leader thinks through is, how do we build those in, and at what pace do we invest in building that?
And when it comes to agency, something that stands out for me in your book, the outcomes thinking, it's been a big part of what I do forever. It's like, here's what we're going for. Let's make this happen. And you've got that wonderful example in the book about the senior leaders disappointed the janitor didn't empty his trash. Well, the locks were changed. I couldn't get in. Okay, that's reasonable. But for a senior leader, what you want to hear is, I took the hinges off the door. Of course, the trash has changed. What are you talking about?
Right.
So getting people to
And I swam way outside my swim lane of accountability of job definition in order to do that. All right, like they don't pay attention to job definitions, and that's kind of the story of a famous rant that Jeff Bezos gave me, and everything was so I got to launch the marketplace business at Amazon in 2002, and he gave me a rant one time about, like, although your job is director of merchant integration, I want you to operate like you run this business. But it wasn't just me he was pointing out. He was talking about everybody that needs to think bigger than just your job at a senior level. And that's the type of culture and heads up play. And that's real partnership, is when you get other people thinking beyond just their little scope. Then you can role play, you can syndicate risks and issues, you can truly pressure test each other's thinking and plans, and you truly become a coherent team that can accomplish anything.
Yeah, I always shoot for an environment or culture where every single team member is the CEO of their own role, and they think about it, they live it that way when they come in 100%.
I agree with that, but so this is an
Yeah.
you have the confidence and the willingness and a place where you can challenge others in their perspectives, right? That's how you actually pressure test ideas. And these big ideas always happen across the enterprise, right? They're never in a nice single, team or organization. And so if you can create an organization that where both I have high accountability of my function, my job, as you were saying, like, I'm the CEO, I run this team, but I also think big. I think like an owner, and it is expected of me. It's not just allowed, but it's expected of me. If I see something that raises a concern relative to the overall mission of what we're trying to accomplish, you play your cards at the table, right? So one of Amazon's leadership principles is, so I wrote a book called The Amazon Way about Amazon leadership principles. And one of the leadership principles is have backbone, disagree, but commit. And that leadership principle in particular is about this notion of you have to be active at the discussion table. If you see something, whether it's your job or not, your job is to challenge, is to ask a question, is to push back against something. But once a decision's made, we all lean forward to making that as successful as possible. That's a high functioning culture and team.
Yeah, I think that's great. My experience, the bigger companies get, there's silos that start to really form. There's empire building. We're going to charge all the business units so we can support this function, engineering, HR.
And passive aggressive behavior where people
Yeah.
don't actually speak their mind in the meeting. They work it behind the scenes, after the scene. It's like, I wasn't convinced that was there. We suggest one way of addressing this in Big Bet Leadership, and it's about how to bring the best out of senior leaders when you're proposing a concept. And the problem is like, senior leaders show up to a meeting, you bring a world-class PowerPoint deck presented by a compelling speaker, and who can resist that? Who can say no? And so what happens is the senior leader is kind of like, yeah, I'm not sold, but I'll go along with it for now. And later on, they show their risk, they show their concern, they show their doubt. Well, the way to set a better environment is to write what we call the 3 Futures Memo. So instead of a fancy PowerPoint, you write 3 memos about the problem you're solving and a realistic future state, highlighting the differences between them. The senior leaders have to read them. And then you ask the question, well, which one of these 3 would you recommend and why? And what would have to be different about the other 2 to make that the recommended path? Now you're asking them you're giving them much more discernible information to reflect on. B is you're actually asking them and helping them tell you what they don't believe out of what you're telling them, right? And so it's not a selling moment. It's a syndication moment where we're syndicating and sharing a potential and what are your real risks. You're asking them to do their job, which is to share their experience with you early. Guess what? When you share a concern or an issue early, we can deal with it. It's when you share it late, we can't deal with it anymore. So that's one way to address that challenge of how do we have these hard, vital conversations early and actually share our concerns. Hey, write a three futures memo, and that will drive a different conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I recommend all of our listeners, read your book, Big Bet Leadership, and you distinguish between memos, PowerPoints, conversations in there, and the power of all of that. Yeah. My question here is, what did Amazon, I'm sure Jeff Bezos drove this when you were there and for a while after. What did they do differently to make this happen? And maybe the incentive program is the biggest part because we can ask people to do things, but how do we get them to really start to live it and develop in that particular direction? Because you can have, here's my 5 rules for being successful. Here's our 12, approaches to leadership in this company. Just do that and it'll be fine. But it's how they do it in all these meetings. Like you can come in and lay out these 5 things, and then 7 or 8 different leaders or 12 leaders all react in ways that now I need to adjust my communication style or address something a different way to keep those things moving forward. But how you do it is everything, in my opinion. So how do
Yeah.
you help leaders to bust through that and then have, especially something as big as Amazon, where you're trying to drive this vitality and alignment and execution at scale to make these big bets happen? Super impressive.
Yeah. Well, there's no simple answer to that, right? Regrettably, there's not like, well, do this and you're going to get there. But here's the key ingredients that go into that cake and everything. First is it is an orientation towards long-term value creation plus short-term results, not just short-term results. And so there is this long-term notion. Bezos talked about that in the 1997 shareholder letter and why they keep attaching that to every shareholder letter. So that's one. Two is true customer curiosity and empathy. That's why, although there's now 16 leadership principles at Amazon, customer obsession is the first and probably the first among equal of those leadership principles. And it sounds simplistic, but having true customer curiosity and true customer empathy and being willing to chase down problems and think longer and harder about what the real job your customer is trying to get done, that is where both operational excellence and innovation comes from. And the third thing, I've got 2 more. The third thing I'd say is have a set of true operating principles. Amazon calls them leadership principles. They're really operating principles about how we work together, how we prioritize what we do. This is the leader's philosophy, and they want everybody working in the same tone and tempo. And the thing we thought about when we were making these Amazon leadership principles is we wanted them smelly. We didn't want them comfortable. We didn't want them to be kind of a poster on a wall. Like, no, we wanted them to be smelly. Things like, oh man, that's a different operating model. Like that is what our intention was to create a high performance team. And a good culture attracts the right talent and it actually repels the wrong talent. As harsh as that might sound, that is what a good culture does. And that is what really good operating principles or leadership principles do. And then the fourth part of my ingredients for this cake that we're envisioning here is metrics, right? Like how you instrumentate the business and then how you make. I always talk about you have to make metrics a verb, right? Like they're not there to admire, they're there to tell you where the issue is, where the error is, and you have to have hard conversations relative to those metrics all the time. That was the entire operating rhythm of Amazon, was a set of cascading operating meetings. And I think if you get those 4 things, so those 4 things were long-term thinking, customer obsession, a set of leadership principles, like operating principles about what we believe and how we're going to work together, and metrics, metrics, metrics. I think that sets the table for a lot of what, the future that, you and I are talking about here.
Yeah. What are your secrets for getting folks to lean into the discipline to consistently do all of that?
Um, demonstrate it as a leadership team. That's what the fractal theory of change is about, right? Which is if you get a small team operating in a way that will fractal down to others, and if the leadership team truly operates in that manner, that will get through the organization. And if you do it in a coherent written manner, then that just codifies what that is. And that's why I think the Amazon leadership principles are one of the key things that distinguishes Amazon, is that, while highly imperfect, they aspire to live those leadership principles. And I think that leads to better long-term outcomes. And especially at a company of scale, if you can be just better than normal big enterprises, like, you're going to rock and roll. If you're a smaller organization, you need to have a high performing team to really win in the marketplace. Well, those leadership principles are going to help you define and create that high performing team environment.
Well, and conversely, if they don't lead by example, then it has a bad effect, going through the organization.
I think the two worst leadership tactics, or things that you see happen all the time, one is insincerity. I think what you're talking about is insincerity, right? I say these are the leadership principles, but I don't operate relative to them. And the second is being sarcastic. I think being sarcastic as a leader is just, and as a parent, is just the absolute worst trait that you can show, because you're actually not trying to help that individual. You're making fun of that individual or that situation. So you got to be sincere, and you have to, sincerity, I guess, is the ultimate betterment of both of those. Like, you can't be insecure and you can't be sarcastic in applying these things.
Yeah, the power in what you just said there. I hope our listeners take that to heart, because I see a lot of bad leadership, I would say, that isn't living what you're talking about. Now, smaller companies usually will say, and mid-sized companies, well, we'll never be an Amazon, we'll never be these things. When I think about big bets, if they're shooting towards doubling the value of the business over the next couple of years, that's a big deal. Or tripling over through. So, like, really getting in there. And I love the metaphor and how to look at it. You want to be a day one company or a day two company culturally. So it all kind of threads into what you're talking about here.
Well, the thing I always remind people is, like, the Amazon of today was at one point not the Amazon of today, right? So I was there from 2002 through 2006. Amazon was called Amazon.toast, Amazon.org, and Amazon.com. The stock was $5 when I joined. Bezos was under a ton of pressure to not take another attempt at a third-party selling platform. So the business that I played a key role in launching was the third attempt at some type of third-party selling approach. There was Amazon auctions, and there was something called Amazon Z shops. And as Bezos said, unfortunately, nobody showed up. And everybody, his advisors, his board, was saying, Jeff, eBay is 3 times the size. We're not going to get this multi-category thing right. We need to just focus in where we're at. And he had the gall and the guts of, like, no, like, I have to do this, but I have to change my tactics. And so we changed our strategy while staying true to, like, we have to get beyond it was a 3-category business: books, music, video at that point. And you add into that strategic patience with everyday urgency to execute against those things that you can execute. And guess what? Over 5 years, we launched what Bezos has referred to as one of the what did he call it, the three advantaged business models of Amazon. And over 20 years, we changed the course, not just of retail, but of international economics, and everything, right? Like, that's what strategic patience with everyday execution can do. Is you can absolutely become Amazon, and everything, right? So I hate starting with the premise of, okay, yes, you're not Amazon, but that doesn't mean you can't be Amazon, right? And, like, what does that mean for you? Not every company or leader wants to be this multi-category international. Great. But you can still be legendary, right? Like, what does a legendary business mean? A legendary business means we win over a long period of time. Okay, now let's ascribe to that goal. Be legendary. Now we're going to do some different things. We're going to have a different orientation to strategic patience with everyday execution. We're gonna invest more time in how we build a culture and a high performing team.
Yeah, and every single one of these companies wants to do better. I haven't heard one say, "I'm super happy right where I'm at. I don't want to change anything." They all want to be better.
They say it, but are they willing to do the hard things and change their personal habits to do something differently? I always joke, like, I'm an industrial engineer by background, right? And it's like, God dang it, I should have been a psychologist too, and everything. That would have been the perfect
Yeah.
combination, because in my line of business, and I think probably in yours, it's like, it's not just having the right concept or the right strategy or the right design, but it's like, how do I get that person to actually change their belief system? Like, do something different. Don't be destructive. Don't be sarcastic. Don't be pessimistic. Don't, do all of these other things. Like, how do I change that individual? Because if I can change that individual, that combined with the right playbook, okay, now we can start making a legendary business. But if I can't get the leadership team, and sometimes it's just one leader, to do something that isn't in their natural orientation, it's kind of a non-starter.
Yeah. Well, I think all of us, if we're students of leadership and we work in organizations as leaders, we are amateur organizational psychologists. We have to be, because
Right.
we're and all of us have limiting beliefs. We all do, but how do we chip away at those with a whole team? And this kind of goes now. This chief sort of communication or repeating officer that you talk about in the book. Here's where we're going. Engage everybody in how we're going to get there, and here's what's in it for you. The incentive piece, and I just love this vitality piece is the kicker that goes into it. I've been a fan of, and I do in all my businesses, of a monthly all hands meeting, even
Yeah,
if it's 500 to
absolutely.
1,000 people. Everybody's on. Here's what's happening with the company. And then the functional leaders get to share the best work that they and their teams are doing to move the needle. And it just keeps that alignment all the way through. To be this chief repeating officer, what are best practices around that? And maybe speak to the power of what that can do for an organization.
Well, the best practices that I believe in come from a book, back to books, called Switch: How to Change When Change is Hard, written by the Heath brothers. And what the Heath brothers talk about is that you have to appeal to both the emotional and the intellectual side of all of us, right? And so the way that you do that is by telling stories, and stories that appeal to the emotion, but also have all the key facts and figures that help actually anchor it into a good or sound business decision or business objective. And that's what you need to repeat, repeat, repeat. And so that's the best practice, is stories with vivid painting of the customer and why this matters to the customer. And here's where we're going. And here's the hard things that we have to figure out, like the journey that we're going to go through. And here's what we think the upside is, right? So I'm using my language carefully to infer that this is a bet. This is a calculated risk. And then repeat, repeat, repeat that. And of all of Bezos' superpowers, I think it's his ability to figure out how to frame, name, and claim like a thing that has to be done, and keeping everybody focused,
Mm.
not just focused on that, but ambitious about why it's going to be so great to get through the grind or the challenges that we're having and everything. Like, that's one of the things he was just fabulous at. And that's what a lot of the Amazon working backwards mentality is about having the anchors of that communication so that you can do it. And then you can, and then we call that the big bet vector in the book. Once you have that vector, then A, you can design to it. B, you can prioritize it against other things. And three is you can tell vivid stories about that big bet vector and repeat, repeat, repeat.
Touch on the big bet leadership and the three main components of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my co-author of the book is Kevin McCaffrey. Kevin ran strategy, enterprise strategy at T-Mobile, and one of his jobs was to build a new business incubation capability for T-Mobile. So new customers, new use cases, new capabilities, new investments to complement the core of T-Mobile. I got to be the senior innovation advisor there for 3 years, and so we built this capability. Think of it as process, but more importantly, like the culture of like why this is a different way of thinking and working relative to their operating business. And out of that, what I recognized was like there's lots of books out there about how teams need to work in an agile environment and, and innovate and everything. And all that's good, but there's nothing specifically about what do senior people, regardless of company size, what's the senior job to be done to lead one of these transformations? Like there's nothing that paints it as a real like playbook of this is what I need to do differently in my role in this transformation. So that's who we wrote for, was senior executives and the teams that support senior executives to help do this job of transformation better. And the 3 sections of the book are big bet thinking, how to create clarity about the problem we're solving and why, and having all this healthy debate and running experiments about them.
Mm.
Big bet environment, which is about putting this, we'll call it program, this team, this baby that you're trying to incubate in an environment that is different than your normal environment because you have to have velocity and priority that doesn't typically happen in your normal programs. And then big bet management, which is how to actually do value-added governance that doesn't slow things down. It actually speeds them up, but it gets to the real heart of the risks that you're facing and the high-stakes decisions that you have to make. I get asked a lot, like, John, what do you actually do for companies? And the simple one-liner is, I help them make better high-stakes decisions so they can take more calculated risks. Because if we make better high-stakes decisions, which are different than your normal everyday decisions, then we can really take on more calculated risks. We can invest differently because we're going to have a different success profile. So that's what big bet leadership is, and a little bit of the story of kind of how this book was born out of work that I got to do at T-Mobile, and all of that built on the books, the mechanisms, the techniques of Amazon, and we rewired them for a company that distinctly is not Amazon and didn't want to become Amazon, but recognize like we have a great operating playbook. We do not know how to reinvent or create new businesses within T-Mobile. That was Kevin's job at T-Mobile.
In all businesses, it seems to me that every day, all the parameters, the dots, the people, the resources, things that we can leverage are changing a little bit to a lot of bit in different parts of the business that can help us go in the direction that we want to go. So I like the idea of an agile organization that can just real-time assess and realign and keep moving it that way. So as I was reading the book, I wrote down agile culture with accountability towards outcomes. And then I put in parentheses unicorn, because it's so hard to do that really well and create that environment. But that's really what it is. It's this change. Yeah.
It's that plus it mirrors that with what I call commander's intent, right? So commander's intent is that top-down definition of here's the problem we are solving, here's why it's going to be worthwhile, here's the future state we're going to, and everything, right? And I've seen this happen all too often where agile teams, because they don't have a strong top-down, like solve this problem, here's the future state we need to go to, they're kind of trying to figure that out through their agile processes versus framing, naming, and claiming it up front. And then those agile teams can be really put to use. And so, commander's intent is a concept from the military about it is the senior person's job to define what the mission is. And that's what how big bet leadership, one of the ways complements a truly agile methodology is by defining with clarity what that commander's intent is.
Yeah, and coming up with a list can be challenging. In the book, I love sort of the power of your question, "What sucks?" And if people that everybody likes to share that, so let's just list it out, and if we solve for it, what would the return on investment be for doing it?
And it sounds like an easy exercise, but really what people get to is they get to a set of pain points or little friction points and everything. But to get to the real what sucks for your customer or for your operator, or for your cost model, you have to get to a deeper level of understanding, of empathy, of obsession about that situation so that you get at the real truth relative to the what they're trying to get done, the job that they're trying to get done. And so while what sucks is a provocative and hopefully memorable way of eliciting that, it actually is the real hard work of trying to get to an insight that is different than just a set of incremental little pains to fix along the way. And that's what we're trying not to do, is just do little tiny incremental improvements. Great. That's what your OE, that's what your operational excellence is set up to do. We're trying to reinvent that pain point. That's when it becomes a high ambition, high stakes road that we're on.
Yeah. As we this hour is going by so fast. As we approach closing, talk about a few big bet killers.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is these big bets die for many reasons. But first is, we've talked about these. I get to do a lot of like pressure tests or QA reviews, and it's like I basically just do individual interviews and I read all the project documentation and I know what's going on. Nobody knows what the true problem is that we're solving, and nobody has a true definition of what the future state is, and nobody understands the true risks and how we're going to test for those early. So they've committed to it and they're on this path to nowhere. So those are the early and easy indications. The others tend to be allocation of resource and how to make it an actual priority. So everybody on the team is essentially part-time. Nobody is really committed to this. Nobody is really accountable for it, right? Everybody is able to kind of point the finger in the other direction, like the jobs conversation we had about the janitor and everything, right?
Yeah.
You have to have a senior leader who is accountable for driving this across the organization, right? So yes, everybody's involved. All senior leaders are accountable, but there is somebody who is truly accountable for driving it. Those are some of the most predictable failure points. We made several artifacts out of the book that if you go to bigbetleadership.com, you get for free. Like, the book is the story. The frameworks are where you put it into work and everything. But one of the best tools we created was called the pre-flight checklist. And it's 26 factors that are the rubric of evaluating a complex situation you're in, a high stakes initiative or strategy that you're undertaking. And the key is that, we have you rank them 1 to 5. An average of 4 isn't good if you have a factor or two that's at a 1 or a 0, because it's a chain link system, right? All of these disciplines have to be either in place or recognized as a weakness. So you're starting to take some compensation move around them to deal with it. This is high stakes, and everything, right? You need competence in this. That's my mission, is to help build the competence in this. It is not a simple beginner's level course in transformation or innovation. Like this is the senior book and framework for how to pull off these high ambition, high risk endeavors. And, we built a set of tools that are really designed for that complexity of situation.
Fantastic. My biggest takeaway from this conversation, I wrote down a lot of things, but it's this notion of having a vitality metric and having a kicker on the incentive side to really align the senior team. Anything stand out for you, or any last things you'd like to leave our listeners?
Simply stated, it's back to the complacency and the lack of staying on the offense, having hubris, and that is in any postmortem of how good companies fail, it tends to be like, yeah, they stopped investing in the future and they became, they developed hubris in their business. Those tend to always be the challenges. How do you counteract that? That's the big bet playbook.
Awesome. And how can our listeners learn more about your work and possibly connect with you, John?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is the easiest. John Rossman at LinkedIn. All my books are at Amazon. You can go to Big Bet Leadership to get all the frameworks that I was talking about.
All right. Thank you. Really appreciate being here. I had a lot of fun in this conversation.
Lee, awesome. Great setup in the band there too. I need to up my game.
Okay. Well, whenever you come to Phoenix, let's do some jamming.
I love it.
All right. And this has been the Show Your Value podcast. If you got some value out of today's episode, please subscribe and like. And until next time, show your value to the world.